Hello, church. Welcome to this week's message. My name is Henry Loke. This is God's Feeding Station. It's an honor to be with you again this week as we continue in the book of Isaiah, chapter 10. We're in verses 24 through 27 today. Talked about how God had promised and left room for a remnant. And today there's a promise of deliverance for those who remain faithful in that remnant. Isaiah, in his warnings to Judah, if you go back and look at what we've covered so far, there is a definite line, a definite distinguishing between those who remain faithful to God and those who are unfaithful. And God is very honest when he speaks through Isaiah and warns Judah of what is coming. If we go back to Isaiah 10, verse 6, against a godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take spoil and seize plunder, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Sounds pretty straightforward to me. God has been very clear to Judah about what's coming through the hands of Sennacherib and Assyria. But to those who remain faithful to him, he now speaks words of comfort. Judgment is meant for the former, the unfaithful, deliverance for the latter. And so we begin today in verse 24, "Therefore, says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians when they strike the rod and lift up their staff against you as the Egyptians did." Already there's a hint of what's coming, because we know what the Egyptians did to Israel, and we know what the outcome of that was. And so God is telling Israel, telling Judah, do not fear. As I dealt with the Egyptians, I'll deal with Assyria. Because the Assyrians will only do what God has appointed them to do. God has set the boundaries of what is to be meted out to Judah. And so they can do nothing more or nothing less. They can only do what God will allow them to do. And their fate will be the fate of the Egyptians, or as it was for the Egyptians at the Red Sea. Because remember, Egypt was the greatest military nation of the time back in Exodus. And after Pharaoh let Israel go, what was then the attitude of Egypt? They felt they made a huge mistake. And if you go back to Exodus 15, verse 9, it says, "The enemy said, I will pursue. I will overtake. I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, and my hand shall destroy them." That's what Egypt thought. How did that work out? How did that work out for them? Right? But Assyria has the same attitude, because remember, we talked about how they think they're doing this of their own military prowess. They think this is all of their own doing, and it's not. God is using them for a specific purpose and will only allow them to do so much. And then God will turn and deal with them in their unfaithfulness. Egypt threatened, but God protected. And the threat was nothing more than that, just a threat. Zion's greatest fear is divine anger, not the threat of Assyria and not the threat of her forces. So we move on to verse 25 now. "For in a very little while my fury will come to an end, and my anger will be directed to their destruction." As all storms eventually do, this one too will pass. And when all is done to God's satisfaction, and Assyria does what God has instructed them to do, Assyria will be disarmed, just like the Egyptians were. And they will cause no more harm to God's people. And the good thing for us, as it was for Israel then and now, God's anger is not everlasting. God will deal with all of us as he needs to, in whether it's our unfaithfulness, our disobedience, whatever it may be. And even those who break God's heart by permanently rejecting him do just that. they break his heart. His anger does come at the actions of some, but I think the overall emotion for God is sadness at losing one of his children who refuse to return to him. But his anger, again, is not everlasting. If you go to Psalm 30, verse 5, for his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. People often use that verse out of context, but you have to look at it and how it's stated. It's talking about God's anger. So for us, we need not fear man. Because when you compare the forgiveness and the grace of and the love of God, what is that to anything anyone of the world or the world itself can offer? Moving on to verse 26. And the Lord of hosts will wield against them a whip, as when he struck Midian at the rock of Oreb. And his staff will be over the sea, and he will lift it as he did in Egypt. Assyria, who is at the moment, the current threat, and it's at Judah's doorstep, she will be dealt with in her proper time. When God's wrath against Judah is satisfied, he will then deal with Assyria. And the rod of correction that he used for Israel will be cast aside or used on Assyria, if she will indeed turn. Assyria brings terror upon Judah, but God will bring terror upon Assyria. If you know the story, you know how it ends. You know what happens. And she's not going to be able to flee from God's wrath and his destroying angel. And there's precedent here in what God is doing. If God is nothing else, he's consistent. Right? Go back to what he references here, the story of Midian, and how God overcame a nation through Gideon with only 300 men. We see the end of it here in Judges 7:25. And they captured the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan. Same thing with Egypt. As Moses was instructed by God to lift his rod over the Red Sea, and God parted the Red Sea, allowed Israel to escape, and then brought it back upon the forces of Egypt, he will act in the same way. He will raise his rod and bring destruction on the forces of Assyria. So our last verse today, verse 27. In that day, his burden will depart from your shoulder and his yoke from your neck, and the yoke will be broken because of the fat. They will not only be delivered from the might of Assyria, they will be delivered from the fear of Assyria. There will no longer be any reason to offer. If you go to 2 Kings 18, you see what Hezekiah is forced to give in the form of tribute. That is no longer going to be the case. And Matthew Henry has this quote in his commentary, but I don't know, he doesn't attribute it to anybody, it's just in quotes, but I'm going to give it to you today and credit whoever it was that said this. It said, they shall not only be eased of the Assyrian army, which is now quartered upon them, and which is a grievous yoke and a burden to them, but they shall no more pay that tribute to the king of Assyria, which before this invasion he exacted from them, shall no longer be at his service, nor lie at his mercy, as they have done. Nor shall he ever again put the country under contribution. Assyria is going to be dealt with by God once and for all. And so Israel doesn't need to fear this. And there's a picture here we need to look at. If we draw back a little bit, not only does this apply to Judah, but this is a picture of the coming deliverance for all of us through the coming of the Messiah. Right? When Christ offers redemption on the cross. Right? The yoke of Assyria is not only removed, it's destroyed. The enemy has her teeth pulled. She's powerless. It's the same thing with sin and Satan. Satan no longer has any power over us through sin or death because of what Christ did on the cross. And so there is a broader picture here of what's to come. And this is all done for the sake of the anointed, right? For the sake of Hezekiah, as we talked about from 2 Kings. He was anointed by God, and he was a king that came back after a line of kings that came and led Israel into idolatry and disobedience and false gods. Hezekiah was anointed and reformed the nation as best he could. And this is done for David. If we look ahead to Isaiah chapter 37, 35, God says, "For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David." It's done for the sake of those who remained faithful or repented and came back to God. And it's done for the coming Messiah, who has not only the view of those in his time and the view of those to come, but the view of those in this time, the view of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom the promise was made to. All those people in the Old Testament who looked forward and believed and trusted in the promises of God and the promise of God's anointed one who was to come. So God will break the yoke of Assyria. He will set the captives free. And the Messiah has come and has broken the yoke of sin and death. And now Satan no longer has any power over us. None of these things holds power over the redeemed any longer, thanks to what Jesus did on the cross. And so the picture here is the promise of deliverance, not only for Judah from Assyria, but for all those who trust and believe in the promises of God and the sacrifice of his Son on the cross.